Hello, my name is Zaradeli, and this is going to be a look at DBCP exposure and worker infertility at the Occidental Chemical Company in Lathrop, California. The goal of this presentation is to shine light on the timeline of events that led to the controversy at the Occidental Chemical Company. We're also going to look at the health consequences, specifically fertility and even carcinogenicity. We also want to look at the impact of the exposure, including the impact on crops, wildlife, and even humans. And then we're going to look at the aftermath of the event, specifically the regulations levied by the EPA. In this presentation, we'll be looking at the timeline of events, background on DBCP, DBCP utilization in the United States, infertility and carcinogenicity related to DBCP, further EPA research on residue in crops, and regulatory action. DBCP was introduced as an agricultural pesticide in the United States in 1955. It was primarily used for tropical fruits such as bananas and pineapples, and it was specifically used because it was more effective than prior pesticides. In 1961, research began being conducted on certain toxicity levels of DBCP, specifically in animal models, and this was prior to it being approved as a fumigant shortly after in 1964. DBCP production began in the United States in 1955 with approximately 3 million pounds, before skyrocketing to 25 million pounds in the U.S. by 1975. Shortly after the peak in production, several workers at the Occidental Chemical Company began noticing that it was difficult for them to father children. This breaking story led to quick EPA intervention, with several surveys finding very significant links between DBCP, infertility, oligospermia, and azoospermia. Shortly after, in 1977, the EPA suspended most uses of the product. However, in 1979, the EPA finally levied a blanket, unconditional suspension of use of DBCP in agricultural products across America. To understand the widespread adoption of DBCP, we must first understand the threat of nematodes. Nematodes and egg-laying nematodes cause damage to the roots via the root system, leaching it of vital minerals, water, and nutrients, and in some cases causing plant death. Previous pesticides, specifically ethylene dibromide, dichloropropane, and dichloropropene, were used. They were effective, however, they were phytotoxic in nature and led to some scale plant death. This led to the production of DBCP, also known as dibromochloroPropane, a highly persistent lipophilic brominated organochlorine. It's effective up to the tune of 16 times as effective as previous pesticides. However, it has the added benefit of not being phytotoxic in its nature. This led to wide-scale adoption across the country starting in 1955. DBCP began being used in America in 1955. In the year 1960, 3 million pounds were produced. There was a somewhat small lull in 1961 due to research efforts to look at toxicity levels and carcinogenicity in animal models. However, after it was adopted as a fumigant in 1964, there was widespread adoption, and it skyrocketed to 25 million pounds by 1975. The National Cancer Institute initiated several studies in 1972 to look at the carcinogenetic activity of DBCP. They did so by utilizing both rats and mice, intubating them with two different dose levels of DBCP. In rats, it was between 15 and 30 milligrams per kilogram of weight for 5 days a week for 78 weeks. For mice, it was between 130 and 260 milligrams per kilogram of weight 5 days a week per week for 78 weeks. In this research, we can see that in rats, 60% showed presence of stomach cancer, while 90% of mice showed presence of stomach cancer after the 78 weeks. Several workers at the Occidental Chemical Plant noticed the inability or difficulty to father children. After these findings were reported to OSHA, studies showed widespread oligospermia and azoospermia to those exposed to DBCP in the plant. Specifically, azoospermia, or the lack of motile or viable sperm, was shown in 13% of the exposed, but only 2.9% of the unexposed. Mild oligospermia, or the low sperm count, was shown in 15.8% of the exposed as opposed to 5.7% of the unexposed, and severe oligospermia was shown in almost 17% of the exposed to DBCP, as 0% of the non-exposed workers had severe oligospermia. Further research was done utilizing a gas chromatograph to look at detectable DBCP residue in crops where DBCP was used. Carrots at the highest level showed 1.5 parts per million, cauliflower showed 0.08, broccoli showed 0.13, cabbage showed 0.12, cucumber showed 0.04, and peanuts showed 0.14. In the 1960s, both Shell and the Dow Chemical Companies jointly petitioned the FDA for broad tolerance of DBCP in agricultural practices. They utilized studies from the 1960s, however, it was only effective in animal models. There was no research done on humans. Shortly after the findings of infertility at the plant in Lathrop, California, both OSHA and the EPA were triggered into regulatory action. In September of 1977, a notice to suspend unconditionally the use of DBCP on crops that accumulate DBCP was put in place. There was also a notice with conditional use for certain crops that did not accumulate DBCP. Soon after, in 1978, the notice was solidified. There was a blanket suspension of all products containing DBCP and the use of it on crops. There was, however, an exception for pineapples in Hawaii, specifically due to their extremely low accumulation levels and their necessity for the local economy in Hawaii. In general, DBCP is no longer used in America for agricultural processes. However, it is still used worldwide, with several contentious legal battles happening related to compensation, fair use, and workers' rights. In summary, DBCP began being used in the 1950s due to its efficiency and lack of toxicity to crops compared to previous pesticides. Research began being conducted in the early 1960s to look at toxicity. However, it was only used for animal models and not specifically related to humans. Due to the fact that the EPA was not formed in 1970 and specific regulatory agencies were out of touch with the literature, regulatory action was not prompted until infertility was shown, and it was too late. Now, DBCP is suspended across the country. However, there are still contentious battles to make sure it is removed across the globe. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you learned a little something about DBCP, its use in agricultural processes, and the importance of maintaining knowledge within scientific literature and processes to help make sure that workers are protected.